Hello class. This lecture is to end lesson 2 and to start in some ways our lesson 3 for chapter 1. So before we do this, I would like to review before everything else so you know where we ended up last meeting. So last meeting we ended here in trying to distinguish the different major sources of our morality that look like moral standards. Last meeting, we tried to identify what standards are and distinguished it from different types of statements. We called standards normative statements. From there, we tried to define what normative statements are and distinguish other normative statements from moral standards, because there are other standards out there that aren't moral anyway. From there, we discussed that there could be normative statements that resemble moral standards, but they are not really moral standards, and we identified those as coming from norms of etiquette, law, and religion. We are not saying that these are not moral standards, or religion, etiquette, and law do not contain moral standards. They do. But the key point here is not all the time. So now, we ended with religion last meeting. And in your module, there are few things that you need to understand regarding the Euthyphro argument. We ended the class last meeting asking you which statement is more true. Do the gods love goodness because it is good, or goodness is good because God says so? If you already thought about it, the better answer is actually the former. Okay? Do the gods love goodness because it is good? The answer is yes. This, however, means nahiwalay ang goodness from God. And since goodness is really good and God is actually good, God agrees with the good. The other option, however, shows us that God is actually one and the same with goodness. This is also This is also a good point. However, there is danger in this position because sometimes religion is identified with goodness or God, which is not necessarily the case. Okay, so if you choose the latter, God is identical with the good, and sometimes you confuse God and the good with religion, there could be 3 problems arising. First is, moral directives aren't really precise. They are general and they are imprecise. Christian morality considers killing as immoral, but people disagree with this sometimes. So in time, you see people agreeing with abortion, you see countries agreeing with death penalty. Well, even slavery was good at some point. Okay? And there are complex moral issues that the scriptures cannot really address directly, like artificial reproduction. The scriptures were written in a time when there was no artificial reproduction as yet. Problem number 2 is we really can't be certain about what God really wants, because no church leader actually can claim that they have a direct line to God himself or herself. We cannot even put gender in God. And problem number 3, if you rely on religion, the result is you rely on the church leader. Morality then would be based on the judgment of another person who commands members to obey without thinking. So there are countless examples already in history na nangyari ito at nag-result ito sa masama. church leaders claim that they do this or they do that, pero mali naman. Okay. The other option, however, is better because it could explain a lot and it could make sense. Like for example, bakit maraming religion? Okay. So the other option can explain that better because religions are actually based on context, culture, history. Okay. And the people who lead that religion, or the people, the members who share a common meaning in that religion, will have a different way of understanding life based on their own context. So the differences lie on that level. This could also explain why there are similarities because religions nevertheless represent values that are consistent with ethical values really. So eto yung level na pare-pareho sila, no? Doon sa level ng ethical level. Okay. Tapos from there, no, I hope you realize the difference of ethics from those three, no? Norms of etiquette, law, and religion here. Okay. Now, what's next is to introduce to you what moral or ethical principles really are. And you have it here. No? These are the four definitions of ethical principles or a moral standard. No? A moral standard that is consistent with ethical principles. If you notice, the number one, the first definition here is pasok pa yung tatlo. No? Pasok pa yung etiquette, law, and religion. The first definition which makes standard moral is that it deals with matters that can seriously harm or benefit human beings. So tungkol sa harm or benefit, sabi na natin yan dati, may kinalaman lagi sa morality pag may nasasaktan, no? Lalo-lalo na nasasaktan at nagbe-benefit. If you notice itong unang definition na to, pasok si etiquette, law, and religion. Yan ang dahilan bakit nyo naiisip sometimes na medyo pareho naman, sir, yung mga yan sa moral principles. Because of this first definition, no? Pasok sila. However, if you go to the second definition of moral standards as ethical principles, hindi napasok yung tatlong yon. Or sige, sometimes they do, but not all the time. Moral standards have universal validity. Rules or norms of cultural etiquette are always applicable only to a certain culture, but not all people subscribe to these practices. Laws are also followed only in a certain country relative to its own constitution. There are laws in the Philippines that aren't laws in other countries. And of course, religion is not also universally valid to all people. We need not explain too much about that kasi ang dami ninyong alam na nangyari sa religion in the past that really caused harm. Look at the third part of the definition. Moral standards are generally thought to have particularly overriding importance. Pag sinabing overriding importance, pag nag-conflict yung dalawang value, okay, mas fundamental si ethical principles. Is there a chance na mag-conflict ang religion at saka law? Of course, there is. So when that happens, saan ka papanig? Well, people would immediately believe that their religion is fundamental. That is okay, but not all the time. So if two values are in conflict, ethical principles overrides all these values. Especially if an ethical principle is undermined. Hindi na rin pasok dito yung tatlo. And finally, yung source, itong ikaapat. Saan ba galing ang ethical principles? Moral standards as ethical principles are not established by the decisions of authoritarian bodies. So wala daw authority na nag-establish ng ethical principles. This is now unlike religion, and law, which are, of course, sometimes, or not only sometimes, most of the time established by authoritarian bodies, nor are they solely determined by appealing to consensus. Law is very much about consensus, mapagtutulagan, no? And tradition here, which speaks for cultural norms of etiquette. So, yung tatlong yon, ang source nila ay actually eto, no? Authority, consensus, tradition. And ethical principles do not come from this. So, saan galing ang ethical principles? Ethical principles are through adequacy of reason alone. So, ito yung four definitions ng ethical principles kung saan hindi pasok yung tatlo. And this explains why sometimes, not all the time, because sometimes consistent naman sila sa ethical principles, sometimes hindi consistent ang norms of etiquette, law, and religion sa ating ethical principles. Okay. Saan sila pasok? Dito lang sa unang category. Okay, here. Okay, dyan lang sila pasok. Okay. Pero dito sa tatlong to, hindi na pasok si norms of etiquette, culture, and religion. But do not misunderstand. No? There are ethical principles that are consistent with norms of etiquette. There are legal principles that are consistent with ethical principles. And of course, religion also has, even if your religions ang gagamitin mo, they have rules that are consistent with ethical principles. And for these principles that are consistent with ethical principles, okay yun. No? Pwede mong sundin, walang problema. But you must be very, very vigilant na baka conflicting at hindi consistent, then you go to rule number, to this consideration. No? Ethical principles are the only principles with overriding importance. Okay. Now, let's talk about activities in lesson 2. So that actually ends our lesson 2. I already actually asked you to work on Baby Teresa and Jody and Mary. Okay. Now, later on, I'll explain this group activity for lesson 2, but let me just briefly discuss with you what Baby Teresa and Jody and Mary cases are. So you were asked to work on this based on your whatever experience you have. Okay, and you were only asked to work on a choice activity where you tap on your best choice, right? Okay, so Baby Teresa is anencephalic. That means naipanganak siya, however, hindi nagde-develop yung kanyang brain. So, walang sensation, walang consciousness. She's not even aware that she's alive. Okay. So, the parents, being altruistic, meaning mas inisip nila yung kapakanan ng iba kasi eventually mamamatay naman si Baby Teresa. They decided to donate her organs kasi marami pang nag-aantay ng organs, no? So maganda ito, no? Magandang decision 'yan. Okay, donate organs, marami ang pwedeng mabuhay gamit ng kanyang mga organs. The problem, however, is Teresa isn't dead yet, no, when they decided to do that. So, authorities actually has to interfere. Why? Because if they decide to donate Teresa's organs, that would be tantamount to ending her life. And that would constitute a species or version of murder or killing. No? So, while they debate the definition of life, Baby Teresa died and no organs were saved. Okay, so you have to make a choice. Which choice for you is better? No? Donate Teresa's organs, but that act might constitute um, murder, or do not donate her organs, but when she dies, the organs may not be viable for um, what do you call this, transplant, no, to other recipients already, at konti siguro ang pwedeng makinabang sa organs. Okay, so just stop it. No? We're gonna need this situations again when we get to other lessons. No? Then we have Jody and Mary. No, they are conjoined twins. Okay, the other one has all the vital organs, and I think it's Mary who shares lungs and blood supply. So the doctors inform the parents that eventually they would both die. Okay, but there's a procedure that would guarantee one of the twins surviving, but just one. And when you do the procedure, the other one inadvertently die. No? Meaning, hindi naman to kagustuhan ng procedure, but that's the necessary consequence. So the choice is, don't do the procedure, but in few years to come, they could both die. No? Not even could, they will die. Or the twins undergo the procedure, one would inadvertently die, but at least one of them would survive. So as religious people, the parents decided not to do the procedure, go through the procedure. Okay, and parang ang isip nila is leave it to God's will. Ganon. No? But the doctors interfered. They wanted um, to of course, they wanted to save the other one who could actually survive the procedure. No? Okay? So, ganun. Pipili uli kayo. I hope you did that properly. Just stop on your best choice. No? Now, itong dalawang to, actually, these are called moral dilemmas. Bakit moral dilemma? Kasi either choice, kung napansin ninyo, either choice would constitute a moral problem. Bakit? If you choose, for example, Teresa, if you choose to donate Teresa's organs, that is something good. No questions asked. But unintentionally, you inadvertently kill Teresa. Okay. If you, however, chose otherwise, hindi ka nag-donate ng organs niya, that's good as well. Pero wala nang nakinabang sa organs niya. Kung meron man, few. At mas marami sana if you donated the organs. So, may positive, either way, may positive, may negative. Yan ang moral dilemma. Ganun din naman kay Jody and Mary. Okay, so, eto, gawin nyo lang based on your own current understanding. That's okay. That's the purpose, no? Okay, I'll explain later on why I'm asking you to do this based on your current understanding. Well, that is something you should look forward to later on sa other lessons natin. Ano tong distinguishing moral from non-moral standards? No? This will be a group activity, and I will upload a group sheet, answer sheet in your MBLE. Okay. So same grouping as we had before. Okay. And then submit the answer sheet next meeting. Okay, so papaliwanag ko tong group activity na to. Ito siya, no? So here, you'll see modified matching type. At eto yung mga choices ninyo sa matching type. Itong 4 na questions na to. So you'll see here statements. A list of statements na igugrupo ninyo sa 4 na categories dito, no? Una, alin sa mga statements na to ang statements pero hindi standards. Okay, so alam nyo na, review, no? Ano ang standards? These are statements that are normative, no? na nagko-contain ng um, preferred behavior. Okay? So usually merong ginagamit na should or ought. But take note, hindi lahat ng normative standards ay gumagamit ng should or ought. May mga standards, may mga normative statements, standards, in short, na walang ganun, however standards pa rin. So, ang clue ninyo if a statement is a standard is it actually sets an acceptable form or behavior. So, basahin niyo yung mga statements na to and then asan dito yung statements pero hindi standard. Just write the letter only. So, discuss it with your group mates. Itong second category, asan naman dyan yung mga standards, meaning normative sila. Pero hindi non-moral, meaning walang kinalaman sa morality. No? Okay, pinag-discuss natin yan. Third category, asan dito yung mga statements na appear to be moral standards but not really. Okay, clue, yung tatlong na-discuss kanina. And then lastly, which of these are really, really moral standards? So, write the letters only. So, discuss as a group, then answer using the activity sheet that I'll be uploading sa MVLE. You can download it, it's in PDF. And then, answer it as a group, then submit it to me next meeting. Okay. So, that actually ends our lesson 2. Okay. I hope you understood and learned a lot. Next meeting, when we meet face-to-face, we'll have a rundown of the discussion anyway to further help you understand the lessons. But for now, I would like to introduce you to our lesson 3. Lesson 3 is actually now about precisely moral standards and ethics. Okay. In lesson 3, the goal is to help you understand the difference between morality and ethics. Kasi hindi sila pareho. Okay. To be able to do that, meron akong mga introductory activities sa module natin, lesson 3, na pwede nyong gamitin to prepare your understanding, to prepare you to the concepts that I'll be presenting. Here, you'll see these pictures in your module. Here, you'll see two persons disagreeing. Okay, about, you see, one and the same thing. Okay, so from this perspective, you see 4, but from his perspective, you see 3. Okay. From here, I want you to understand what ethics is. Okay, by trying to see how this problem could be solved, because they're looking at one and the same thing but they have different answers, because sometimes experiences like this, ang issue ay isa, one and the same thing, pero iba ang hitsura, figuratively speaking, because you're looking at it from different perspectives and you are different persons. So problems could be like this. You're looking at one and the same thing, but you are two different persons, therefore you are having different answers. So the ethical thing to do is perhaps you would want to check the other's perspective first. That's an ethical way of doing it. No? Here you have an elephant and there are persons looking at parts of the elephant, and each of them has a myopic view of the entire thing, entire animal. So may isa rito, sabi niya, ano ba yan? Spear, yung trunk. Ito naman, it's hindi ko mabasa. It's too tiny from my perspective. Sa wall, ito, wall. Ito naman is fan. Okay. Ito is snake, sabi doon sa kanyang trunk. Then rope doon sa buntot. And then 3 yung paa, no? So, what's wrong here is that sometimes people cannot see the bigger picture, no? And they end up quarreling, insisting against each other na eto siya. But sometimes yan yung nangyayari sa atin. No? We are merely looking at reality in different parts. And we don't get to realize that all of us are partly correct but entirely wrong. So the ethical view here is to step back and enable yourself to see the bigger picture. No? If dito is try to see the other's perspective, dito naman perhaps reality is larger than us. No? Etong picture na to is, I hope nakikita nyo. Pag nakikita nyo to, tignan nyo sa module ninyo, try to guess ilang taon siya. No? Ilang taon siya. Okay, kasi dalawa ritong babae ang makikita ninyo. Isang bata at saka isang matanda. But it is possible na yung matanda lang nakikita ninyo and you will find it difficult to see where the younger one is. Or vice versa. You'll see the younger one first, but it would be difficult for you to see where's the old woman is. Well, to some na familiar, nakikita nila agad, no? But the point here is, sometimes we are conditioned to see the old woman, sometimes we are conditioned to see the young one. And that means the way we look at reality may depend on how we are conditioned to do so. So, ibig sabihin, we might end up understanding reality not as it really is, but rather as or how relative to how we are conditioned. Okay. So the ethical view is to understand that we have determinants. No? We are partly determined by our environment, our biology, our culture, and sometimes we commit mistakes because we insist on our own background without realizing that reality is more than what we are accustomed or conditioned to see. Okay, and that would be the ethical view. Finally, I would want you to read the battleship story in your Module 1, page 39. It will also give you an idea what ethical principles are. And that's a true story, by the way. You'll see that in your module. And I have pictures there of a battleship. No? The battleship there is Mighty Mo or USS Missouri. The tourist battleship in Pearl Harbor. No? So that story will give you an idea what ethical principles are by contrast to other principles out there, no, as represented by the battleship. No? I'll leave that to you to understand. No? And then eto rin, anthropologist and the island villages in page 40. Okay, lahat ng mga kwentong ito will help you understand what will prepare you to understand what ethical principles are when we start discussing lesson 3. Okay, introductory activity ng lesson 3 yung mga yan. Alright? So, for the remaining 30 minutes, I have been discussing for 28 minutes now. For the remaining 1 hour, you group together and work on your group activity and the introductory readings for lesson 3. Okay, class, that's all for this recorded lecture. Bye.